typically the way states make policy decisions and orient themselves surrounding public policy is primarily around GDP growth and how they will maximize that GDP growth. We say that they equate things like GDP growth and they equate policies with happiness, while simultaneously acknowledging that those metrics are not the best way in which we may evaluate happiness. Rather, we say you should use accurate metrics rather than just using proxy metrics where we say things like, oh, GDP growth can equate happiness, but rather use that very metric itself and actually close the information gap. So the model for this is as follows. We would say this is primarily set in Western liberal democracies and states that actually have the capacity to orient themselves around this policy. I think that's reasonable. We think the way you would actually conduct this is likely a happiness census. We would say you would do this at least on an annual basis. It would be using a large representative sample, large cross-section. I think we're relatively flexible about the process, but the point we are trying to make here is that we would like to have a broad representation of individuals completed within the census, like very clearly. And so, yeah, and we're not going to like compel policy changers to do this. We say a world in which people did this would be preferable than one in which it does not happen. I think that's probably... Sure.
Are you going to allow every individual's happiness to range between, say, -10 and 10, or could one individual's happiness hypothetically go up to 50?
Okay, so I think for the purposes of clarity within the census, we would likely create a limited range by which people can evaluate individual happiness. I don't think this debate is like how the census works. I think this is rather a debate about the broader principles around the way in which states make decision-making calculuses. I don't know why people are like outraged about this. I think it's actually quite reasonable. This isn't the debate. Sorry. Okay, 3 arguments in this round. The 3 arguments are, first, the role of the state, second, how it changes policymaking, and third, how it changes society. Now you can do the clarification.
Is there anything off limits if it would make people more happy?
Okay, so I think it's very key to acknowledge that probably a vast majority of things would simultaneously sacrifice certain individuals' happiness to like a great degree. So like if you're saying like is genocide acceptable because it would make some people more happy, I think like again that's like not really the round. I think this is just like I think a lot of these points of clarifications are like very arbitrary in terms of what we're actually discussing, which I think is like reasonable policy changes, reasonable happiness. This is just like taking up shit tons of time. Okay, first on the role of the state. So the role of the state is that it is a collection of individuals who gather with a goal of raising the quality of certain elements of the human condition. We think one of those elements of the human condition is increasing the ability of individuals to have happiness, and the only reason we consent to the state in the first place is because we believe the state to be the best facilitator of that maximization of happiness. We think insofar as that is the case, it is primarily the job of the state to evaluate the happiness of the individuals who comprise that state, because recognize it is not the state which has the primary knowledge of what is going on with the citizens, but rather the citizens themselves, who then use the state as a way to enact their own desires and a way to actually create policy changes that are able to better allow them to enact like their identities and how they would like to engage in the human condition. But we think we also like enshrine a variety of freedoms even when we recognize they like sacrifice efficiency or when we recognize that they are in opposition to things like GDP growth. For instance, we enshrine things like freedom of religion or speech, even if we think that by not enshrining those things we maybe ought to maximize GDP growth, we simultaneously acknowledge that there are certain things that outweigh that and that we ought primarily focus on individuals' abilities to actualize and have identities. But the second thing I want to talk about, which I think is much more on the pragmatic level, is actually how it changes policy making. So I think having this central mandate actually changes the very way we interact with policy making at its most foundational level, which is the problem right now is that the way we interact with policy making is purely on a basis of numbers maximization of things like GDP growth or whether or not it influences the states we interact with. I think we justify all the time incredibly unhealthy things as a result of a belief that will maximize things like GDP growth because we think GDP growth equates things like happiness, even while we simultaneously know that in many instances, individuals do not actually believe that economics is the way in which they achieve happiness, but rather it's through things like satisfaction with children, satisfaction with family life, and prioritize things that are economically inefficient all the time, because that's the way they view their happiness as being best maximized. We think, for instance, we justify things based on like corporations many times and sacrifice happiness at the expense of things like corporate growth. So what happens, for instance, is we have local environmental degradation all the time as a result of prioritizing corporations' needs. So what that does is it does things like cause environmental degradation within poorer areas of the United States, for instance, which greatly decreases the health of those individuals and as a result decreases their ability to engage in things like happiness, even if we simultaneously see that the GDP growth of the nation overall grows as a result of that policy, but diminishes happiness in that certain area. idea. We think instead what we ought to do is orient policy around actually focusing on things that do create happiness within individuals. But we also think we've seen examples of states do this successfully many times. So for instance, France has very long vacation periods for many of its citizens because they recognize that those citizens have better happiness as a result of those vacation times. Or for instance, Norway and Sweden have great levels of paternal leave as a result of the recognition that the happiness of those individuals is not through economic capitalization, but rather through actually spending time with their family and developing those connections. So I think it is inaccurate for us to say that the only ways in which people actually gain happiness and that the way we should make policy decisions is whether or not it actually does create like capital gains. But I also think that what it starts to do too to policymaking is it changes it so that the discussion of happiness is actually viewed as a legitimate political complaint. So when you complain to the government that you are ignoring the ways in which I interact with my life and maximize my happiness, that is viewed not as like fluff, which I think is a completely unfair way in which to view those complaints, but rather sounds like a substantive argument because the government itself acknowledges that those complaints are legitimate and are the way we ought to orient policy. I'll take a POI from top half if you have one. No? Okay, cool. But I think it's very important that we actually do view happiness as like a discussion of a legitimate political complaint. But third on how it actually changes society, sure.
Okay, so given that France has this work week without a happiness measure and no nation has a 7-day work week, what is your policy going to change?
So I think we would change it so that other states begin enacting these kind of policies at much higher rates than they currently do. Like this simply example, if you acknowledge that that kind of thing is actually good and something that we should capitalize upon, then I think in our world we actually get a much larger states actually doing this policy instead of it simply happening in certain places like France. So I think if you acknowledge and concede that it's good, then we ought to do it. But third, how it changes society. So recognize that the government begins to be perceived as actually working in conjunction with the individuals rather than in opposition to it. So many times we view government intervention as antithetical to our ability to maximize happiness, but when the government's very stated goal is the maximization of happiness of its citizens, you get a much higher ability of individuals who actually appreciate that government. But I think also it changes the way individuals begin to conceptualize happiness, right? Like one of the reasons people conceptualize happiness as being premised on things like economic advancement is because that's what the state uses to measure happiness as things like GDP growth instead of actually using things like actual happiness that people do. So when we start to change the metric and it starts to become different and simply based on individual conceptualization of happiness, it actually changes the way individuals on an individual basis conceptualize their own happiness and ability to actually achieve happiness within their daily lives. I think it's very clear that this would actually lead to much better policy making. For these reasons, proud to propose.
Here, here. I'd like to thank the speaker very much for their remarks and call upon the leader of the opposition to continue to try and debate. Here, here. Ooh. Come on, man.
What a chap from the shadow panel.
People on me.
Honestly. Mr. Speaker, I'm not quite sure what first proposition we're expecting to do, but we don't propose entirely making policy decisions on GDP. Right? We can do this on other metrics which states view as important. I'm going to talk about two things today. I'm firstly going to talk about, one, how we think this metric will actually be used. Probably going to be a bit more liberal than even first proposition think this should be used and consider broader things. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why this is the wrong conception of development and policy making on 3 different levels. Before I do that, let's have a look. Firstly, this GDP thing. Development and what stage states are at in development, including Western liberal democracies, can be measured on a number of things, right? Firstly, we look at things like consumption index of what families are actually doing. Secondly, we use things like the SEN development index that measures weighted inequality in countries and looks at individual citizens, opposed to just GDP growth. We also use things like the SEN, Master SEN's just great, right? Use things like the SEN freedom index, which measures how freedoms have been realized for people, particularly within countries. That means that it's not just about pure economic growth, as First Proposition wants to talk about, and we do look at actually maximising freedoms when we can use other measures, which we're entirely fine with using on side opposition. So they don't just get to say, oh, you only care about economic growth. Of course we care about other things, right? Secondly, they then look on to say how when we actually look at what happens with happiness, what this leads to is a consensus within decision making that will allow people to enact their identities. it's not clear why a census which measures a snapshot of happiness in time will lead to the overall realization of people's identities, right? No one even mentioned Bhutan in first proposition, right? Bhutan is a pretty like authoritarian monarchy, which is the only place that uses this, right? It's not clear, but by simply an authoritarian government enacting things which they view as though to be in the overall interest of their countries allows a maximum conception of freedom within that. More of which is going to be on my case. So, thirdly, they said right at the start of this in response to a very reasonable point of information from second opposition about how will this be measured, and they said, that's not an important part of the debate. Of course it's an important part of the debate when the entire thing is that this is going to be used to make public policy, right? Of course it's important because the way in which this is measured analyse exactly what this means to those people at a particular point in time. For example, do you just measure this after you've provided a tax cut which has been funded that takes away from low-income housing in a single city, right? That might hurt a minority group within that region, but means that actually the overall country goes, hey, tax cut, that's awesome. That's going to be in my case, right? So first of all, let's look at how this metric is used. The reality of doing something which is a gross national figure of this means that it is a single government that at best governments try to just average, right? It's an immediate metric that if you're looking at what this means to happiness of individuals is currently what satisfies that population at the current snapshot in time, right? Therefore, the best way to maximize that is to make people the happiest they can be at that particular moment in time, right? Now, we could, though we didn't, get an argument about what of overall long-term development, what if we care about those figures? Firstly, you're not giving other clear metric as to what informs you, what metrics you inform those other decisions, right? If the majority basis of the calculus for this is making decisions on what is that short-term happiness in time, then it is short-term happiness provided through a census of what currently satisfies individuals that will be your thing for making that. So we have to accept it's going to have that larger impact on it. But secondly, it's likely to be an overriding metric because it's meant to encapsulate lots of other figures, right, for all of the exact reasons the opening proposition outlined. So secondly then, why is this the wrong conception of development, right? So Bhutan takes surveys in a similar way to which first proposition made out, although not quite the same, on a number of different metrics of feelings, right? They wait and try to validate this as much as possible. We say right from opening we want to make very clear that people do not know what is best for them in the long term. And what is best for them in the short term as a conception of what might make them happy does not mean that they will be satisfied in the long term on an individual level, right? People routinely prefer things like low taxes and high spending, even though in the long term, this might mean that they're screwed, right? If according to you, if you believe what I said at the start about how they want to maximize this long-term average and short-term decision-making, it's likely, therefore, that governments will preference those kind of policies in regards to public policies, rather than one that look at overall long-term investment in actually what you mean. Therefore, what we say is that there's an overall trade-off. Because this therefore means that if you're basing decisions on gross national happiness as to what makes your policy happening now, it A, doesn't mean that your population are likely to be happening in future, but secondly what this ignores is things like intergenerational justice, right? It ignores things of what might make populations happy in the future because you're basing policy decisions on those single figures and trying to maximize those, right? Sure. But secondly, onto a much larger thing, we don't want this does go on here, Gregor.
Okay, why do you assume that any demographic metric that measures gross national happiness would necessarily be a snapshot in time? Why can't we take more advanced census data that actually has been collected over the past 5 or 6 decades about generational and long-term happiness for individuals?
Yeah, sure. Because as I said, right, this is always going to be backward-looking as to those individual snapshots in time, right? It's always going to be at that point in time, what satisfies that population, as opposed to looking towards long-term policy decisions. That is kind of the entire point of the debate, right? That you have to argue what is best for individuals' happiness in that short-term means that you'll get it in the long term. Secondly, on a more broader point, even if you don't buy that, we fundamentally think that what this does is oppress minority groups in countries, right? Because what we think this does is this says an encapsulated in an overall figure is what therefore makes the majority of the people in that country most happy. What you now do is, because democracy is always a trade-off, right? It's always a bit of a trade-off between saying it is what the majority want and therefore that's the basis on which we make decisions, yet we must fundamentally fundamentally protect minority rights in certain cases, even if the majority want to oppress them. What this means is if you make this a basis for making policy decisions, you're likely to care about that gross, that majority, that's national happiness, which is lead to things likely about not caring those minority groups in future. It means by taking that as a single snapshot of what the overall population think, you don't therefore analyse a dissection of the individual impact on certain groups within those countries. So thirdly, we say this is likely to lead to much more authoritarian governments, see Bhutan, but I'm going to let Wilmore talk about that. For all those reasons, we're very happy to oppose.
Here, here. Alright, I'd like to thank the speaker very much for their remarks and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue this round of debate. Here. Yeah.
Honorable Speaker, in his speech, Simani basically alludes to a bunch of goals that ultimately point towards something amorphous that he never articulates that the state should be striving for. In giving this speech, he falls exactly into the trap that Zoe and I lay out for you, which is that all that the state does is try to maximize happiness through various metrics that they now measure through inexact and false signaling mechanisms. Unless they can provide us with an alternative end goal that they are trying to purport that is something other than the happiness, calm down here, you're giving yourself a heart attack. The net happiness of the op bench is low right now. Oh my God. Anyway, I know you're insecure, but it's okay. So I think that fundamentally, what you need to establish is what is the goal that is contrary to happiness that can only be fulfilled by the op bench, because all that Charlie actually does for all his razzle-dazzle is pick at what would be bad if you did this in a really dumb way, right? Like, yes, the articulation, so like, the point I'm going to give you now is the conception of the model, because I think that they like really radically misrepresent what Zoe actually gives you, which I think is actually a dynamic and a model that provides for a debate about the core issues, rather than like the shittiness that op has been trying to drag it down to since their obnoxious POIs in minute one, right? So what we tell you that the conception of the model is that recognize that there are already existing indexes on how the existing indexes and algorithms that have been employed and like designed by various sociologists and various academics towards how we should measure happiness within a state. And we think that there are differing circumstances where this would benefit differently, right? So we think that, for example, a state that operates in a federalist system or a provincial system could probably do things like we can actually test the laboratories of democracy in the United States and say, look, if a particular set of policies are instituted in California and in New Hampshire, and you have differing abilities to look at the happiness indexes, that allows you to have a certain metric. The issue of this debate is not how exactly are we going to measure the particular happiness index in New Hampshire, it's should the government orient itself around this conception at all, and is happiness the primary factor that ought to be the productive capacity of the state to legislate, and should that be what legislators are pointing to when they say that something is worth voting for, when they say, look, happiness indexes rose 20% in the districts that enacted these sorts of policies. So we're fine with them being done on a gross national level, we're fine with them being done on local levels. Recognize that we do these exact same sort of delineations for any other index that they would advocate for. Like, they act like it's so insane that there's not going to be one perfect way. Like, yeah, you measure economic growth in particular states sometimes, and you're not just like, well, look, we just sent 49 states into the shitter just so New Jersey could be really happy. Never sacrifice happiness for New Jersey. But I think that, like, this is just like total malarkey to, like, quote Joe Biden out of op. It's just making me really mad. So I think that this is the conception of the model we tell you, that should we have dynamic systems that use these indexes of happiness to fundamentally shape that policy, and should the adequacy and the success of those policies be adjudicated on the basis of the data that comes from those? Don't be obnoxious, sure, back out.
Worldwide happiness indexes already exist. Sierra Leone scores in the top 10 despite having among the lowest life expectancies on Earth. Do you seriously believe that those people have access to a more meaningful life than citizens in the United States?
So I think that, like, honestly, this is like a pretty offensive POI. Like, yes, one of my best friends is a Peace Corps volunteer in Sierra Leone. They are, like, yes, like, I think that there are fundamentally things that would obviously continue to make people happier, having a higher quality of life, continue to like, have access to various health metrics and like those sorts of things. But I think that, like, yes, in the developed world, we are pretty fucking unhappy. That is the point of this debate, that we should switch this conception that somehow, because we're like living in like a certain like quality of life, that people that like happen to live in a less developed country couldn't be more happy. That is a fundamentally offensive assumption of late capitalism that tells us that that's what we ought to value, and that's the way that we ought to conceptualize our own well-being. That is the challenge that we're asserting here. Like, yeah, if it's like more productive for us to have people living like oriented towards happiness as opposed to productivity or these false conceptions of happiness that we produce from the state, we think that's absolutely true. And I think that insofar as there are also ways that these metrics might fail, we'd say that, like, yes, revising the way these are done. I think that having them look at trends, having them look at over time, recognize that these indexes are also done, like, are you happier than you were 5 years ago? Like, these are the sorts of questions they ask, like, and they ask on those particular metrics. It's, should the indexes be oriented around happiness? And I think that, like, yes, if it's about, like, the, you know, housing cuts that Charlie talks about, like, yeah, probably you can have a happiness index. Like, do you find this new policy yields greater happiness? And on these various metrics, I think that they didn't actually provide us any substantive argumentation about how a government ought to conceptualize these sorts of things. So then secondly, what, like, will these policies ultimately look like, right? Because I think this is kind of the, like, orneriness that we get out of back half shirt, top half. Go ahead.
Okay. If it would make people happy, would you allow them to sell everyone in the country into slavery?
Okay, so here's again the ridiculous of this. We give you the corollary of right now we largely orient states around things like growth. Recognize that we don't do that at the enslavement of everyone so that we can, like, build the pyramids again. Like, yes, we say that there probably ought to be constraints, and I think that ultimately the disutility of the massive unhappiness of all people in slavery is probably one that would yield that. If people would be genuinely happier in enslavement, you need to tell me why we shouldn't do that. I don't think that's a very likely story. That sounds like probably I'd be pretty unhappy, but, like, maybe if we're all, like, really cool, like Princess Leia with metal bikini slaves and just, like, having a good time drinking in Jabba's hut, fine, we can do that. But, like, you need to tell me why we shouldn't do that. Okay, but Leia didn't seem happy. She was not psyched. Moving on to, so what these policies would actually look like. Because, like, Harry's like, look, France manages to do this and they don't even measure happiness. Yes, they should do more of it. What we tell you is that fundamentally, right now we see these things as a sacrifice to productivity and something that is done for the people and their kind of, like, base desires against, like, civilized society and the goals of, like, growth and, like, building civil society in a, like, global economic market. We think that we should, rather than seeing these things as, like, goods at the expense, we should see this as the fundamental good and the fundamental end. So when we tell you that when we see, like, much higher happiness when things like mandatory paternity leave mean that actually men actually engage in things like childbearing and feel a connection with their family, we think that all states should have some sort of compulsion to actually engage with that. And I think that we'd see people would maximize that much more, because right now, like, places like the United States, places with more industrious, like, views about, like, growing, like, the economy, not to, like, shit on the French being lazy or something, that, like, this is basically the fundamental idea that we should have more of an orientation. You know, like, my Republican dad loves to talk about, like, maybe the French are happier, but their quality of life is lower. Like, what does that mean, Dad? Like, the quality of life is your happiness. We fundamentally measure quality of life based on your income bracket. That's madness. That's lunacy. That's what they need to tell us why we should orient ourselves around that way. Okay, so, like, a little bit more, like, a rebuttal. I think I'd, like, pretty thoroughly shat on C-Money. I'm sorry, this is a very homey round. It's gotten a little casual. So I think that, first of all, this idea of, like, this is the wrong conception of development, because they say that people do not know what is best for them in the long term. Like, obviously, if you're enacting policies that then, like, 20 years down the line make people deeply unhappy, it's almost as if you would change those policies that are now making people deeply unhappy. Like, that is the point. It's the metric that we oriented around. That's what they needed to engage with. Instead, they engaged in pedantry and mocking. Very proud to propose.
So I'd like to thank the speaker very much for their remarks. Invite the deputy leader of the opposition to continue this debate. I'll remind everyone to keep it down a little bit, and I'm going to close the window a little bit because I'm getting cold. Or I'll just...
We all good?
Yeah.
Everyone's moved around, sector. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a debate about whether happiness is a nice thing or not. That's not what this is a debate about. This is not a debate about whether individuals being happy is nice. That's not how this debate works. This is a debate about aggregate happiness. This is a debate about asking whether taking the average increased happiness of a population as a whole, even when that clashes with the interests, rights, and indeed happiness of certain individuals, is a legitimate metric upon which to base policy. We say that long-term social rules and rights are incredibly important, both for genuine longer-term happiness, but also for the protection of minorities who will suffer under this policy. Okay, so let's look at, I'm going to look at 3 points today. First of all, about the crude quantification of human experience. Secondly, I'm going to look at the role of the state. And finally, I'm going to look at why this will always be authoritarian. First of all, we get this idea that the role of the state is only ever to increase the human condition, We say that that's an incredibly complicated metric, which doesn't just mean handing out average happiness to the most people you can possibly find. We say rather, as I will tell you in point 1, this is incredibly complicated. They also base a lot of their first speech upon this idea that the crude quantification of GDP fails to recognise the diverse experience and diverse interests of lots of individuals. We say that gets even worse to the point at which you're basing all public policy, not just upon GDP at the moment, because notice we also do GDP, rights, interests, like lots of various metrics. When you decide to quantify it into one number of how much happiness you can create, that is a much worse quantification, which is much less representative under their own metric, their own understanding of the status quo. No, thank you. Next, they say that we currently justify terrible things through the over-quantification of GDP. We say that only gets worse to the point at which you reduce the number of interests you can have. Then they say this will now finally be able to change society, change individuals' understanding of their own happiness, because at the moment I only understand my happiness based upon GDP, because that's what George Osborne talks about in the budget report. I just don't think it's actually genuinely true that individuals understand the genuine happiness of their own lives based upon the proclamations of politicians in like small private political discourse. That just doesn't seem particularly legitimate. And finally, they say, finally we get this very odd point I'll take you in a moment out of the previous speaker, that actually to be poor, have a terrible standard of living, but just at least be happy with it would be lovely. We say that's a fetishization of poverty, which hasn't been acceptable since Mother Teresa. We're probably not okay with that. I'll take closing.
Okay, so a population census gives you the number of people who live in a place. It also, though, in order to get there, contains a ton of cross-sectional demographic information about age, race, and ethnicity, etc. Why is that information then not available to the government to have a more informative thing than just a number that's bandied around?
Oh, it absolutely is, but notice we got absolutely no nuance in terms of the mechanism for promoting government. They just say we will now have a number ranked like 1 to 10 supposedly on how happy people are. We say you can't rank human happiness on a simple basic scale. Even if you have cross-demographic interests, that doesn't tell you what people actually value more. It doesn't tell you the list of different things which people value. Moving on then to my first point, and thank you, the crude quantification of human experience. Because notice that humans are nothing if not incredibly complex. All culture, music, literature, art, for the last 5,000 years has told us that we have lots of very different conceptions of what love, happiness, enjoyment might mean. We say that quantifying that into one simple policy is never going to actually represent that broad variety. Next, we say that quantification also requires the aggregation of this multiplicity. The aggregation of this multiplicity both within individuals in terms of the broad number of different interests that individuals may have, but also the much broader spectrum that you get across society. Notice the point that you just have to take an average which makes everyone the least not happy or the most happy. It's actually very possible that no one actually ends up that happy at all. That there might actually be policies where you actually focus on certain interests which actually have a much greater effect in terms of actually making people's lives significantly better, but fail to work out on this sort of broad, blind calculus where you have to take into account everyone's interest no matter how much they rank them or not. Finally, we say that going through these incredibly unifying measures completely destroy what you have under the status quo, right? Well, we have the broad variety of metrics upon which we discuss social and public policy. Where we talk about a moral minimum for certain individuals, where we talk about happiness, where we also talk about GDP, where we talk about a broad number of different metrics which better represent that diversity of interest, and allow for a more diverse political discourse where we can talk about a more greater variety of things. Yeah, okay.
So I tell you that oftentimes the policies we enact through economic productivity disproportionately harm poor and minority communities. Why would they be so much worse harmed when we create things like
You're absolutely right. If we only based all of our policy upon GDP, that would be a terrible world in which to live. Perhaps that's how it happens in the United States of America. But actually, in a lot of the world, we've taken a broad variety of different interests, including rights, happiness, to an extent, GDP, lots of different interests. We say unifying this into one codifiable measure of interest is just simply blind and doesn't work. Then they tell us that the role of the state is to understand human condition. However, given the plurality that I talked to you about in the first point, it seems therefore the state can't really just be deciding policy upon the short-term sways of happiness. Rather, what we do is we create broad social rules which allow individuals to better realise those long-term gains. We'll come to my third point, why it's important. We create moral minimums to protect minorities. Notice no response to Charlie, right? When he says that, look, some minorities will just get sold onto the bus under this policy. For example, in the United Kingdom, if you poll people about banning all immigration or not allowing immigrants to use public services, but that would probably increase net happiness. That just would like be better off in the UK. That would massively sell the most vulnerable individuals under the bus. Notice why we have these moral minimums. Human rights come in at the point at which populism fails. That's why we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. That's why we have the Beijing Pact for Action after Bosnia. It's because it's when populism fails, when you need those moral minimums, that it becomes most important. Why then will it always lead to authoritarianism? Because short-term policies, which are able to most increase human happiness, for example, just before elections, are always going to be ones where the state is able to most control the outcomes of that policy. The one where they're most able to ensure that individuals are making choices in the short term which are going to make them look happier just before the election and therefore feel like a particular government has done well. So first of all, this looks like the oppression of minorities. But second of all, it looks like authoritarianism because of that increased control. Because they're more likely, for example, to put CCTV everywhere so they can reduce crime just before an election. There's no looking, therefore, at actually the long-term benefits that come from an increasingly liberal society. No looking, therefore, at the long-term benefits which allow individuals to represent that massive plurality, that multiplicity of interests which I talked about, which allows them to actually articulate and individuals to actually gain that real conception of the good life which you get under a liberal state. You're not going to get that under this new model because authoritarianism will always happen because it allows governments to have the most control upon the outcomes of these censuses. It is illiberal, it is authoritarian, you sell minorities under the bus for the rights of the tyranny of the majority. For all these reasons, very, very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for their remarks and call upon each member of the government to continue this debate with
Mr. Speaker, I think the great tragedy and the great existential crisis of modern era is a conflict, ideally between aggressive socialism and the type of materialist capitalism that we think has enshrined itself in the West. I think the type of theoretical strawman-esque debate that opening opposition wants to engage in, I'll probably engage them on that level, especially because they've never even given us a counterfactual as to a world where we actually accept the premise that we can make people more happy. Then I'm also going to because they're seen so finicky about the definitions of what happiness means, I'm going to try and attempt to give a definition of happiness, which mind you, no one else has done in this debate. I'm going to explain the ways that we've actually collected demographic data in the past and what these policies actually look like in a much more aggressive sense. But before I do that, let's get into a little bit of rebuttal. They say that we're going to use a complex understanding of human nature because human nature is complex. This is just asserted. We're going to use a consumption index, we're going to use a freedom index, and on some level, we're going to use a happiness index. There's no response to the argumentation that we get at opening government and that we're going to extend in closing government as to why, if you assert that some people will be more happy in a situation in Cote d'Ivoire where they're incredibly poor, right, where they have a significant risk of dying from day to day, if you're more happy, why would you prefer a situation where you're a billionaire in the United States? I've been given no reason on opposition why you would prefer one over the other. No reason why life is not meant to be more about happiness. Why would your life be more fulfilling if you had a bunch of money, which are the traditional metrics of happiness? This is completely asserted. I think this is a mistake of the modern capitalist and materialist agenda that we think is incredibly bad. This oppresses people a lot more. I would further assert that if you want to, I would prefer to live in a Catholic fascism if it meant I was more happy. I would much prefer to live in an authoritarian dictatorship. Why is authoritarianism bad if it actually makes the individuals living underneath it more happy? Why is it worse to be a slave but more happy than a person that is not a slave? I think that certain times, like fear of death, can cause a lot more of an existential crisis than just having more money. I would prefer one over the other, Mr. Speaker. No counterfactual they're attempting to defend. I think you should definitely punish them for this. Furthermore, they say people don't know what is best for them long term. I think they have a much more hedonistic and bad materialistic understanding, especially in the types of states we're talking about, which is exactly why we need this type of metric. We need to present them with the types of advanced social demographic data that we've collected over the aggregate to say that people that get more money aren't more happy. It's the people that have stress removed from their lives that are much more happy. It's the people that have more time with their families that are much more happy. It's the people that think that they have more freedom in choosing their different careers because we have massive income taxes that are more happy. This type of data is the type of data that we think politicians should use. I don't know why this is definitely our side, right? That politicians should be attempting to use to motivate populations in opposition to the type of data they're using in the status quo, which is it would make the economy better. It would increase GDP. It would give you more rights, in quotation marks. I don't know why more rights necessarily means more happiness. You can't let them get away with these types of assertions. They say that this is going to necessarily lead to the oppression of minority groups. I think that sociopaths and psychopaths are more the exception than the norm. I think more people people have sympathy and empathy and actually want to be in a society where people aren't rampantly oppressed, I think that you can see that this is actually not like the only reason that we care about oppression of minorities, not because of UDHR. It's because we can actually have empathetic and sympathetic connections between people, and we see that when they're starving, we would rather they not be. I think that the only thing that you get out of opening opposition is don't do this in a stupid way. Great, that's a fantastic op. I don't think we're definitely locked into the idea that we need to do it in a silly way. Moving on to extension, no thank you. What do we mean by happiness? We don't think that happiness is momentary in the sense that it's hedonistic. We think happiness is much more complex and it's much more eudaimonic. We think it's flourishing of the whole person. It's satisfaction that's cross-sectional, that's over a time series. We can actually collect the type of demographic data. I'm going to give you a sample set of census questions that we would be asking. I think it's not just a survey, it's much more holistic. Lots of policy is hedonistic in the status quo, and this is where we see the major problem. It's short-term, and it's based on personal avarice. This is why people can play election cycles that say, we're going to, like, read my lips, no new taxes. Why? Because no new taxes means that you'll have more money to spend, which means they're assuming that you're going to be more happy. Whereas a politician that says, you will be more happy if we tax you more, which means that you're not going to care so much socially about comparisons of wealth, or about the types of jobs that you choose to take. Question?
Right, but if they do that, if they promise those things, if every single data point has shown them that when they make those promises in the past, people are less happy, then why do you get those policies?
So if you're asserting in this thought experiment that every single data point that we've ever gathered has pointed us toward a particular policy in terms of maximizing happiness, I'm going to say that probably I have faith in all the scientists and all the individuals that have gathered this type of social data point, and I think that those types of policies are generally good, right? Furthermore, surely a sufficient response. How do we achieve this? I think the way that we achieve this type of happiness in a more holistic sense is by a couple of ways. First of all, we think that we can achieve this type of happiness by reducing stress and by maximizing individual choices, by reducing individuals' insecurity and maximizing stability. This gives the greatest level of personal freedom and reduces relative comparisons socially based on success. This is why most people aren't happy in the civilized Western world. All that was in quotation marks if you were taking notes. Why is this approach to policy crafting unique, and we are the only ones that gain access to this type of approach? Because it allows justifications for policy that would be incredibly unpopular otherwise. This is the type of metrics that we'd be taking. We force elected officials to actually depend policies on a level of impact in terms of happiness to individual populations. This puts a premium on narrative and communication, which means that you can't have tiny populations skewing the type of demographic data one way or the other. We think this is incredibly important and actually allows minority groups that are being oppressed the types of narrative explanations that we think are incredibly important that they're denied in the status quo. Here's the way that we would collect some type of census data. Do you find satisfaction in your work? How would you rate your daily stress? How often do you feel a sense of existential dread? Do you use your time in a way you enjoy? Are you doing something meaningfully worthwhile? Do you think your children will be happy because people actually think long-term and think in terms of future? Do you think that people around you are happy because you think that when people around you are happy, you are generally happier? These types of complex questions don't just result in a number that they're talking about. It's much more cross-sectional, it's much more complex, and this is the type of survey that has been done in places which show you that in places like Norway and the Scandinavian countries, people are a lot more happy than in places like the United States. Here are some of the policies that we think that would be implemented as a result of these particular types of demographic analyses. First of all, we think that would result in massive income taxes, upwards of like 90%. Why? Because it relieves social pressures of success so people can choose what they want to do irrespective of the amount of money that they're making in these particular jobs. Mind you, a lot of people try and become investment bankers, especially that are debaters, and don't become teachers because actually becoming a teacher really feeds your soul, Mr. Speaker, but becoming an investment banker just feeds your wallet. I think that if you have massive income taxes, just removing one level of calculus probably gives you a lot more freedom. How do you spend your time? This is the real question that this type of policy is asking. You should assess how you spend your time based upon what makes you most happy, not the type of rewards you're getting. Who gives a shit about compensation if it doesn't actually give your soul any food? We think it would lead to heavily socialist redistribution of wealth to provide social services to remove stressors about financial stability. The stressors like job availability, stressors like healthcare, education, and stabilization. We think that it will result in these types of policies that have actually been borne out in areas of the world that have had this type of demographic data tested and consulted. With all these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
All right, I'd like to thank the speaker very much for their remarks and call upon the member of opposition to continue this debate. Here.
Everyone ready?
Here.
To be clear, we do not have a 7-day work week at status quo because guess what? GDP is not everything at status quo, as OO point out. The issue is that unlike the proxies for happiness that we use in different circumstances depending on the different policy considerations we're making, happiness is not uniquely mensurable, and happiness is not comparable between individuals in the way that all of opening, and all of closing for that matter, whatever they told us in extension, want to presume. There are unique harms to the particular metric they are bringing in, fetishizing, totemicizing, and making the center of all policy decisions in future. In extension, I'm going to talk first about how it's illegitimate to decide on one definition of happiness. Second, on how happiness is inherently positional and the awful consequences of entrenching that as a state policy. And third, about how happiness is inherently non-additive and why it is bad to have a policy that assumes it is. First, rebuttal. Opening. We have no idea what policies they might want or how they're going to work out what happiness is. Taylor goes, but the AWP is amorphous. No, it's not. It's status quo. We use different resources that signal happiness depending on the particular criteria we think are relevant in that instance and are measurable by quantifiable statistics. Conceptions of happiness are not enough to win you around in something where we have to talk about actual things in the world and you give us none. What are the policies they eventually give? But France should do more than it currently does. How much? We have no idea, right? I think the equilibrium France has is quite nice. I'm not really clear why you'd want less than 35 hours a week working at the point where your GDP tanks and structurally France is way worse off than the US and the UK. It's not really their position to say that's a better policy. They don't really tell us why. But B, they go child rearing for husbands. Look, the point about that policy is it's successful for Sweden because it actually makes husbands more productive in the long run at the point when they're not taking time off later in their lives because they feel like their lives have been screwed over at the start. You need to show that there is a difference between happiness and economic productivity, and not one that can already be measured by the sorts of things the state already does. CF the fact Sweden puts in that policy without doing happiness surveys. Then, CG give us a slim extension that's mostly definitional, talks about eudaimonia. They say the status quo is based on personal avarice and no new taxes was a problem. 1. If voters are as clever as you claim, no new taxes would not be a thing on either side of the house. Rather, we think that dumbing down and simplicity is already going to exist, so we'd like a more comparative example of the way those sorts of things are going to happen. But second, they say, why care about money? I just like to point out, why care about happiness in the abstract to the point where they give us no way of comparing two different people's happiness and why we should care about one more than the other. Then they talk about questions in the survey like, what is your existential dread? I'm sorry, people cannot reasonably answer these questions. If you want an essay, right, I have no idea how you turn them into quantifiable numbers the state can use. They need to be much more specific. On the policies, right, 1, they are all bizarre. I'm not sure why socialists would be happier than right-wing people, right, given the example we gave you of Sierra Leone, which is not socialism, where people are pretty happy, right? Second, though, it's really non-unique. To the extent those better policies already exist in countries, they're not just countries use happiness surveys. I'm really confused as to why they want to use these metrics. Extension, first, happiness is subjective, right? There are different areas that matter and how they matter to people. Your policy entrenches one definition of that for universality, says that someone can only care as much as everyone else as far as how happy they are. So they can only ever go up to 10 or down to minus 10. That's bad because first, it stymies other objectives that are more specifically linked to the issue, right? So airports make us happy. On the other hand, noise makes particular individuals unhappy. On your side, there is crowding out of the large number of people who are marginally happier by the people who are extremely unhappy by those sorts of things. Equally, you could argue it goes the other way. The point is that on your side, those subjective measures that are not clear to measure are much harder than for states to take broad perspective, long-term visions on how these sorts of policies will be enacted like you do at status quo. Second, though, you say that happiness exists in one way. So Taylor says, it's really bad when the state says that money is equal to happiness. No, because the state doesn't pretend, as OO point out, that money is equal to happiness, right? The difference is on your side is the state is literally saying their definition of happiness is happiness. So the active harm on your side is you make anyone who doesn't feel like they're happy through that metric awful, because that's the sort of thing you entrench by saying the state's happiness is a better vision. Third thing, though, you restrict people's freedom to pursue their own good life. Because CG says, what's the difference between a billionaire and an orphan? Here's the point. If you have money, you have choice, which is the most utility maximizing thing, because you can pursue your own conception of happiness to do whatever the hell you want with the money you have. On your side, you're locked into a very particular policy the state has decided is the best fit average of what everyone wants in face, rather than what any particular individual wants to pursue as themselves. We say we should let free agents do what they want and facilitate options, rather than just allow everyone to pursue a best fit model, which is exactly what their side does. Second, on positionality. Structurally, surveys in happiness have two problems. One, they're always short-term focused, right? No matter what people of psychologists try to do, they can never go beyond 45 days. I think OO do a lot of good stuff on this. The second thing, and more importantly though, is those surveys are relative to where you could be. People are happy relative to what they think they might be able to make. The huge issue, therefore, is to favour keeping people in a position, right, where they don't have knowledge of what they could rise up to on your side, right? Which is why people in poor countries are happy at the point where their authoritarian state does not let them see outside of the current existence they are living in, literally segregates people or whatever. What are the awful consequences? One, there's an incentive never to show people opportunity, right? It is legitimate on your side, right? I'll take no closing in a second, to crush the expectations of poor kids, for example, on the basis that, well, they're not going to be able to see the better vision they could have, so they'll be happier. Because that's structurally how happiness surveys work at status quo, right? Equally, the income tax they talk about, never let people see the long-term better vision of a state they might have. Closing.
So the baseline conception of happiness that we give you, that you haven't engaged in, we think is universal in terms of a lack of stress or a choice of how to spend your time. Are there any individual experiences that you think that would not want a maximization of these two factors that we've given you? If you can't respond to that, we think it's
no. I'm really confused, right? Because both those terms in themselves are fuzzy, and you've never given me any reason to believe that anything else might not factor into it. I'm not every person on the world, so I can't tell you what factors would factor in. The point is, there are certain policies where certain things should be weighed more or less strongly, right? And you don't count factor for that. Taylor.
So you say that money buys choice. Do you think this is maybe because we have a society where we say things like leisure and success ought to be measured on the basis of your capital?
Okay, so I'm not sure what else is going to buy you choice on your side, given us no alternative conception. Money is presumably going to continue to exist because it's the most efficient way of organising people, all who have individual competitive interests. Given that status quo, we should maximise choice within that framework, given you never told us we'd have a different framework. You didn't say, we're going to turn it into a liberal fantasy utopia. The second thing, though, that's awful, if people are long-term put in worse situations than they could be, right, then it's both awful for them and for future citizens, right, at the point where their country pursues a worse development track because people aren't given access to greater opportunities. It's illegitimate for individuals now to stymie individuals into the future. Third point on non-additive. The problem with surveys is it assumes you can add person X's happiness to person Y's. First, that assumes people don't have minimum levels of happiness, right? We have an obligation to care about that and they don't. The second thing, though, is it's subjective for different people. So something that makes you 3 less happy could make me 5 more happy or whatever. You limit the extent to which that happens, but the big policy on your side actually is you legitimize single issue people to crush marginal improvements, right? So if racists are made really, really angry by large numbers of immigrants improving the economic stance of their country as a whole, your policy allows that massively to outweigh at the point where their happiness swings from 10 to -10. Equally, right, the crushing of minorities that OO talks about, we've now actually framed in terms of how it's likely to function. At the point where you have a happiness function that assumes everyone's can be added up individually and put together for happiness. This is a very bad idea, I suppose.
Alright, I'd like to thank the speaker for their remarks and call upon the proposition whip to continue this round of debate here.
A remarkably frantic failure of really any kind of advocacy coming from the opposition until Harry gets up here and gives us the lovely question-begging, freedom is utility because at least people are choosing it. I think this is fundamentally the ideology that he's challenged across the entire government bench, which is that a capitalist system says that through your own agency and through your own choices, you can choose what the good life is. Your hard work will afford you the opportunity to purchase yourself the security away from the harms of the world, and that will be your means towards accessing happiness. The problem is, not everyone can access this narrative. Not all of us get to be the kind of people who go to international debate tournaments and talk about how much they love libertarianism. But additionally, these metrics often do fail for many people. Now, whether or not you believe our vision, which is actually just one articulated by social scientists who do this kind of research about how the marginal utility of money and the freewheeling billionaires do not actually become happy, that does not change the fact that we at the very least would cause an investigation into these kinds of narratives that even at this high level of a debate round become question-begging nonsense and flippant hand-waving about how freedom is good. There are 2 areas of clash within this round. The first one is how do these metrics function and how would they work with the intent of policy? Look, we actually, first of all, we just get a reorientation of public policy that's incredibly more technocratic, right? As in, we don't need to defend the fact, which you can actually say on either side of this debate always, that people may not understand what's going on, and voters will be ignorant in how they understand politicians' messaging. The question of this debate is, what ought policy be predicated upon? As in, what kinds of metrics ought policy actually consider, not what should political party platforms be? Look, if we have designed a series of beautiful bills on our side that never actually would get passed, that wouldn't change the fact that they would be what public policy ought to be predicated upon, this is a question of what ought to be the intent, not just a nihilistic debate-destroying, let's just remind everyone that yes, it is often hard to get idealism passed. So what do we actually have on our side of the house? There are a variety of different reasons why this kind of metric would lead to far more sophistication. So the first one is, it's cross-sectional and across a time series. They can't beat this argument by saying it's just going to be a number when you create that number by asking everyone. A census is literally you ask every single person in America, which means you can have cross-sectional demographic information which people can access. I actually think this is far more likely to be inclusive individuals than non-inclusive of individuals. So for instance, we may not believe that racial profiling is an issue in America unless we notice that there happen to be places where people have the same amount of income as other people, but it seems like everyone in Ferguson is really unhappy. Gee, I wonder why. Maybe it's because they're all funding their local police department by getting randomly checked and getting a bunch of speeding tickets from racist cops. I think this is the kind of cross-sectional analysis of what's going on in a country you could get if we actually ask questions that look deeper than economics, as in, are there problems going on that are dragging people's happiness down? I also think that this is value shifting in a way, because it does demand a question of merely because our ideology has told us something will make us happy, is that information actually borne out? Because I think that if they're right on their side, all our metric would do is confirm their statements, right? If Harry Elliott is right, that freedom is utility maximizing in the long run, we would get information that makes people happy. They only have two good responses to this. So the first one is that at the point that it's an aggregation, it crowds people out, which completely changes the fact that we're still investing in a kind of research which has to, by definition, be cross-demographic. That's like saying collecting economic information in order to get net GDP. Just because net GDP is bandied about doesn't mean there's not stuff under that. So I don't see why that would change things. Additionally, though, all of the arguments from Opening Up about moral minimums and how a tax break is just not as good as making sure people have access to clean water are arguments for our side of the house. Because if they are right, there are things that people must demand in order to be, in some sense, satisfied in society. Those would necessarily be the kinds of gaps that we would notice on our side of the house, because if they're right, they would be causing the most disutility. The fact is that they discursively understand that some kind of question-begging pedantry about how tax breaks will make people happier in the short term is exactly the kind of argumentation we go against on our side of the house, because our metric peers beyond what people think about the short term of a policy and just start asking over time what actually worked. As in, starting from 10 years ago, what kinds of changes led to which kinds of demographics responding in a way where they actually reach a higher level of satisfaction. This is why pre-course extension is not just bandying about. It's saying that the premise of individual satisfaction is not just a slapshot of, did you like that sandwich you ate today? It would be a question of what is your role in society and has it reached a level of satisfaction, which we think is the only question people should be deciding upon, rather than what they counterfactual they have to defend on their side of the house, which is exactly the kind of ideology, question-begging, lean on the Constitution, political platforms that don't actually ask genuine questions about what will make people better. Go for it.
John, we told you right from opening that measuring gross national happiness, i.e. literally the words in the motion, right, being used as a metric is always likely to lead to minorities being oppressed at the expense of potentially bigoted majorities. Is that a harm you are willing to accept on your side?
I just think that that might be true in Bhutan, but it's not going to be true in Western liberal democracies that have economists, right? Like, all we did is articulated a way in which the actual act of data collection is far more enhanced and far more intelligent than you saw coming. That just means your arguments are bad. The second thing we want to talk about then is what policies will actually be deployed. So we're not going to become shallow authoritarians at the point that if our research is actually honest, we will notice if our shallow authoritarianism is making people unhappy. Go for it, Harry.
Okay, we can stop electing racist police boards on either side. Given surveys are structurally to where you are in society, why isn't there an incentive to stop showing and giving people the opportunity that only some of them could ever reach on our side?
Okay, so the problem they have on their side of the house is that I'm not sure what means of reaching counterintuitive claims or realizations about society we have in a system that is ideologically frigid, as in it sticks in one place because it assumes that further investigation is not necessary. Our side, by making it on a gross national level and actually having this kind of data mining, will cause us to come to realizations about, yes, specific minority groups would not be considered otherwise, because for once we're actually asking them on our side of the house because it's a census. That's one of the reasons why we're going to be winning this round. Look, on their their side of the house, the only way they can win is if they claim that authoritarians will just crowd out everyone else's view because they want net happiness generally to increase. What we would tell you on our side of the house, though, is that the relative utility of most policies to most secure people is not going to change that much generally, which means that our policy, by definition, if you actually consider what human satisfaction is really about, which is that there are basic standards that people need to not be food insecure, to not be education insecure, to not be job insecure, that those are the people who will be suffering the most, which means that our metric, by definition, is demanding that we consider them, whereas on their side of the house, you can cry about freedom all damn day. And you know what? Those same people they claim they're defending on their side of the house are merely treated as free and never actually get public policy consideration. And for that reason, we're tremendously proud to propose.
All right, I'd like to thank the speaker very much for their remarks and call upon the opposition whip to wrap up this round of debate here. Here it is.
No pedantry or mocking in this speech, just explanations as to why we won. The reason I asked that point of information about Sierra Leone is that it hints to the fact that the positioning of people in societies arbitrarily defines the total conception of complete happiness that they are capable of conceiving of. What does that mean? It means that if they think it is normal to die at 35, they will never ever force their government to stop stealing money and invest in hospitals, right? That is because the normal life in a society, in a way in which they are circumstantially obliged to conceive of it, is one in which people are always worse off. And that's something that we didn't really get a good response to from closing, that Harry told you quite a lot about. What am I going to tell you in this speech? Firstly, what these surveys will look like. Secondly, how the results will be used. Thirdly, why happiness is an awful goal as stated as the main objective, and why material well-being is the best one to do. Firstly, what will these surveys look like? Because we hear from the back, from the entirety of closing, mainly from the back, opening didn't know this was going to be a problem, that these surveys are not going to be snapshots, but rather they're going to look back in time and look back at what decisions made what differences in happiness. The problem with this is, firstly, it's not the motion, because the motion is about measuring and making policy decisions based on aggregate national interests, right? But let's secondly think about whether or not that is actually possible, and if so, is that the case they ought propose? Because these surveys will have to measure snapshots in time. If they wanted the surveys that they like to tell you about, these surveys would likely be 10 pages. Statistics have shown that people start being less honest as they get past the first page of a survey. That means that the entire goal that you get, and you literally need to defend the capability of surveys as being an efficient way of measuring public opinion, right? This is part of the debate, not something you can laugh off by saying that statisticians know how to do it, because they don't at their own admission, right? It is not the case that surveys are an effective way of doing this. That's why variance exists as a concept, right? Variance is likely to be significantly worse on your side of the house, at the point at which you're measuring something that is remarkably amorphous and incapable of being put down to be a single thing. Secondly, how will these results be used? Because Charlie tells you that this likely means, because we are talking about aggregate national happiness, the kinds of policies that minorities will always lose out. What do we hear in response from closing? This is really laughable. People are not psychopaths and sociopaths. People have more empathy and sympathy, and so they will make policies be generally nice. What is the problem with that? Policy making is not about whether or not people are psychopaths or sociopaths, but rather about whether or not they are capable of internalizing trade-offs to people who are not themselves. Yeah. Namely, whether or not they are capable of thinking about a poor person's losing housing at the expense of them maybe buying a new Bentley, right? That is the trade-off they need to show that individuals are always capable of making. We tell you that the reason we have structural protections in democracies, right, things like constitutions, is because individuals are shown to have not been able to internalize the experiences and the happiness of others, right? It is not the case that minorities will win. They needed to concede in order to win this debate the fact that minorities will lose out sometimes, and that it is fine because we increase national happiness. They were unable to successfully answer that question in both opening or closing. They lose. But how else will these kind of results more likely be used, right? But let's compare this to the status quo. Because in the status quo, France can get a 6-day work week. What does this mean? The only thing that we advocate for, which is the status quo, is that individuals are capable of making these trade-offs and expressing their preferences in a political system that is responsive. That namely means that if people feel like they are suddenly working too hard, they will start rallying behind labor unions that start like advocating for things like shorter work weeks and more work holidays, right? That is something that the system is capable of responding to. Namely, if individuals feel like their conception of happiness is better achieved on aggregate by having a shorter work week, that is a policy you are likely going to get anyway. What they need to defend is that happiness ought be the only goal we try to optimize in all cases. That is not the case we got. The case we got from opening was status quo at best. The case we got from closing was unclear.
Sir.
No. So, thirdly, why happiness is an awful measure to strive for and why material well-being is the best. Mainly, the majority of this case. Firstly, why happiness is an awful goal to state. No response to a lot of the stuff we heard from Harry. What did he tell us? He says, firstly, that happiness is positional. Namely, you are more capable of being happy if you are exposed to less, generally the position of people around you is less generally materially less well off. Why is this important in this round? Because it gives states the incentive to always lower the aggregate happiness so that people in general are more capable of feeling like they are more happy. Why is this problematic? Because we think that states sometimes strive for goals, like increasing life expectancy, for instance. Yes, go.
Okay, people in Scandinavia are happier than the people in the United States and Britain. That is because of the set of policies that we articulate in extension, financial, educational stability, etc. Even if that comes at the sacrifice of seeing wealth accumulation possible, why should we prefer, or why should we not prefer
the reason people in Scandinavia are happy is because they have the most robust form of social welfare that they get from oil revenues, not because they have the highest tax rate in the world. It is also true that I might add that social welfare has been dialed back when oil prices fell a couple of weeks ago, right? It is not the case that that is because of income redistribution. It is the case that that is funded by blessings of natural resources. And if that's the case, you also need to defend, and I'll take you in a second, states like Saudi Arabia oppressing women because they feel like that is the way that they maximize happiness among the stakeholders they care about, namely religious men. Go.
So the crux of your op is that people don't know what makes them happy, so the government needs to ensure long-term things that will make them happy. If it does make them happy, that's our side, and that's what we would enact. If it doesn't make them happy, why should we prioritize the name of happiness over actual happiness?
The point of our case, which is what I'm about to tell you, is that people are best placed to achieve their own conception of happiness in a system in which material well-being is the only goal that states try to facilitate, right? The states shouldn't play a role in kind of facilitating ends for individuals, but rather it should ensure that people are best placed to achieve and most capable of achieving their own conception of happiness. Why is material well-being the only one to do it? Because we think it is possible that a conception of happiness is not about just having less stress and being more free, right? It could be that people like nicer things. They like food that tastes better or cars that cost more because they can move faster on the road and make them feel like they're more powerful, right? These are kinds of things that are incapable of being put down, right? Yes, diminishing marginal returns to wealth exist, but namely, up to a certain point, wealth doesn't have any diminishing marginal returns. But secondly, and more critically, there is never negative utility with diminishing marginal returns. Yes, a billionaire might need a second billion to feel as much wealth as they needed to feel like in their first 500 million, but it's the case that they need that because their capability is improved in life, right? Not the case that money and material well-being is always a bad measure to use. Instead, it is the best measure to use, because it gives individuals the capability to pursue different choices in life. The state plays an instrumental role as opposed to an authoritatively declaring what a happy life is and legislating towards that end. The surveys are awful, the way they get enacted into the political system are awful, and happiness is a bad measure in and of itself. We beg you to oppose.
Alright, I'd like to thank our debaters for debate. You guys can cross the bunch of hands and